Digital Forensic Research Lab. Naima joins us today to define and discuss the role of misinformation on the internet. Naima, I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'm going to take a second and share my screen because I do have some slides to show you all. So I'll get those up and then we can get started. Okay, you should be able to see those now. All right. So I am Naima Green Riley. I am an academic, but formerly I was a Foreign Service officer. I worked at the Department of State. And so I come to the issue of information and information in the digital space from the vantage point primarily of foreign policy. And then as I started to delve deeper into the area of disinformation, misinformation in the transnational sphere, I started to realize that this is a much it's a much deeper question than just a question of international relations, because as we know, information is used all over. It's a domestic and an international phenomenon. And so today we're going to be talking about the increasingly troubling problem of false information in the digital space. And I'm going to spend some time putting different types of definitions to different terms that we can use to talk about different problems in the information space, because often we get pulled into using one term or another, and that actually obfuscates the broader issue at hand when we talk about information space and information issues. So just as an overview of what we're going to talk about today, I only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to try and go through it quickly to make time for questions, but I'm going to try and categorize some different types of false information we might see on the internet. We'll talk a little bit about who propagates false information, who exactly is it, because there are many sources of problematic information on the internet. And then we'll also go through some examples just to sort of solidify all the things that we go through. And I'm actually going to be using some other sources. Some of them are from the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, of which I'm a non-resident fellow. Some are from actually First Draft News, which is a great organization and resource for some of these issues. And so all of this material is out there and accessible if it's interesting to you, and you can learn more. Now, why did I call this presentation the information dilemma? What's the dilemma and what type of information are we talking about? There are a lot of terms that have been used to characterize not just disinformation, but the broader category of problematic information. Some have called what we are facing an infodemic, and actually that term originally came from 2003 during the SARS outbreak, when all of a sudden in Asia, people were getting lots of information along with this epidemic about the epidemic, and some of it was true and some of it was false, but it was very, very much a whirlwind. Fake news is a term that we've heard often, and most people associate that term with Donald Trump. But you can go back and look at media, and people were talking about media all the way to the 1890s in the United States, and you'll see references to fake news. It's not a term that Donald Trump coined. It's been around for a long time, and that makes sense because the word fake and the word news are not particularly original. And so anyone could imagine what that is. And then some people have called the information dilemma that we're facing information disorder. So that would categorize all these different problematic types of information. And particularly First Draft News uses that term. I like it a lot because basically what it shows is that there's some problem with the information that we are getting, and we need to try and suss out exactly what the problems are. And so I'm going to use that framework, the First Draft News framework of information disorder, a little bit, just to go a little bit deeper into the three different types of problematic or false information that we're going to talk about today. So this is a graphic from a great report by First Draft that's available on the internet. I'm actually going to show you a resource slide at the end where you can find the report. But they categorize mis, dis, and malinformation based on a spectrum that has two different attributes. So they think about both the falseness of information and also the intent to harm. And along that spectrum, you could have in this sort of a Venn diagram, you have on the left side, false information that isn't really intended to harm, and that's misinformation. So they define misinformation as unintentional mistakes, such as inaccurate photo captions or dates or statistics or translation, or even humor that's misinterpreted that leads to confusion. On the other end of the spectrum, you might actually have information that's not false, it's true, but it's released with the intent to harm, and that would be malinformation. So deliberate publication of private information for personal or corporate public interest would be an example of malinformation. And sometimes there are small changes to the context or the date or the time of some real information in order to cause problems for the person that the information is targeting. So WikiLeaks would be an example of malinformation. Then in the middle, you could have information that's both false and released with the intent of harm, and that would be disinformation. And so disinformation involves a fabricated or deliberately manipulated audio, visual, written content that is intended to cause some sort of harm. And that might be creating rumors or conspiracy theories. That might also just be making a certain person look bad. But through this spectrum, we start to see that there really is a range of different types of information at play here. First Draft News also has a really great spectrum to think about scales of harmfulness, because there are actually lots of different types of content out on the internet that all do pretty negative things. So you can see that on the slide. I'm not going to read all of this through, but once again, if you want to link to this report, it's a fantastic resource for really thinking about the different types of information that you can find in the digital space, all of which is problematic and could cause a lot of harm. When we think about the sources of these types of information, there are many. So because I focus on foreign policy, I came into the space really focusing on government actors, because it is known that many states use information in some way, and sometimes uses of information are not negative. In fact, the government's relation to information should not be negative, right? Governments should be providing information. They should be sharing information across their borders, even in a transnational context and in an international community. And so sharing information is not necessarily a bad thing. And yet and still, we find ourselves today at a point in which often governments will release negative information with an intent to harm, or false information with an intent to harm. And so that's one source potentially of false information, but others might be political parties or non-state political actors or businesses. So there is an entire industry now of entities that wish to propagate false information because it's lucrative, right? So that's where troll farms come in. If you can get together a business and either be paid by one of these other actors, the government, a political party, a non-state actor, some influential individual, to spread false information, then you make a lot of money off of that. Or if spreading false information will somehow help you to gain a better platform, then you also might want to spread it as a corporate entity or as a private company. And then, of course, private individuals also sometimes spread false information. But I think the most important thing to know in all of this is just that ultimately, most information operations involve, both a primary source and then a network of people who are propagating the information on the behalf of the source, whether intentionally or not. And so the way that really, really successful information operations and really successful programs intended to harm work is that they get lots of folks to sort of spread the information online, and they might think it's true, and that's why they're spreading it. I'm going to wrap up just by talking a little bit about some examples, and I'm not gonna run through all of these, but I'll give you two different examples because I had four, but I want to leave time for a question. So let's think about a military example. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, and all of a sudden, Ukrainian soldiers, so folks in Ukraine on the opposite side, Crimea had been taken from Ukraine, started getting a wave of SMS texts, and these texts basically encourage them to defect from the military. And so that is something we would call a PSYOP, or a psychological operation, actually commonly used by a lot of militaries, and that's an example of disinformation used in a military sense. But on the other hand, we could think of disinformation being used in a civil sense. So in 2015, in the Philippines, then presidential candidate Rodrigo Duterte actually hired troll farms or click armies to write pro Duterte comments on the internet, and some of them contained a lot of lies, they contained misinformation, and yet they were aggressively promoted across the social media sphere. And so that would be an example of civil use of disinformation. There are others, and you can find them all right here. The Digital Forensic Research Lab has a great GitHub and visualization hub for you to actually go through lots of other examples. And I also got my definitions, as I mentioned before, from First Draft News. But I think I should probably at least take one question in the remaining 4 minutes.
Naima, could I actually ask you a question and step in?
That'd be great.
I have one from Grady as well. Just real quick, what do you think is the potential for some sort of, I mean, we're hearing a lot about regulatory movement in this space. Do you think we're going to see something, and what are the big issues there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's so complex, but there really is a lot to figure out. I think the best way that I would describe it is that when we think about regulation, we have to think about what we want to regulate, because there are a lot of things. So sort of on the tech side, the big things that people are trying to get regulated are things like privacy. So how private is information on the internet? How protected are social media users? Things like antitrust, right? So how big can these social media companies be, and how much can they sort of run the entire market? And some people allege, some people say, it is the opinion of a lot of people who focus on disinformation and misinformation, that if we just fix those issues, privacy, antitrust, a lot of the issues with disinformation will be addressed, because they will, because they're concerns of the everyday person. People want to be able to access good information. And so if we just give people more privacy, and also if we don't allow corporations to sort of run so much, then we'll automatically address the information dilemma. But increasingly, there's been discussion also about whether or not we should be regulating like how information can be shared on, for example, social media platforms. And it has put, I think, a lot of companies like Facebook's and Twitter's in a strange situation, because in some ways they feel like they're being asked to be arbiters of truth, and arbiters of truth with governments, right? So how do Facebook and Twitter, who are based in the United States, treat the US government in one way, but the government of Russia or China or Turkey or some other country a different way? Where do they decide that information is false or true? Do they have the capacity to determine if information is true? And so it gets kind of tricky. And yet we have started to see more regulation that's just gone on, not from the government side, but just from companies who have decided, you know what, we're going to label this information as coming from a state-controlled media source, or we're going to take down this information because it looks like some sort of coordinated, inauthentic behavior is at play. And so it's a really complex issue. I do hope to see some further movement on it during this administration, but it is yet to be seen. Guess we only have 1 more minute, so there might not be time for another question. Oh, I see a Q&A right here. One person asked, and I'll say in the last 30 seconds, what are the roles of education and personal responsibility to manage information disorder? Yeah, I mean, I think that this is another aspect that the government is really considering right now, is can we implement media literacy so that people get these basic definitions? And can people learn in schools how to detect whether the source of an information, a piece of information, is trustworthy or not? And so right now, the problem with that is that the education system, most schools are administrated by the state, not the federal government. And so it takes movement on these issues at the state level in each individual state in order to get to a point where you have media literacy programs that are mandatory. And so I think that's something that could be pushed for. Well, I don't want to go over time, so maybe I should stop there. I did see one more question, but I don't know, what do the organizers think?
Sorry, sometimes you have to move the mouse a lot to get over to the stop start video button. I think we have to head to the next panel, but that was fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you can stick around, we have been using the hallway tracks to answer additional questions and have some more time for folks. And we'll do that with our next break, but I'll turn it over to Victoria for now to introduce Sherwin. Thank you.
Thanks,
guys.
Amy. Naima, that was a very lovely presentation. So I would like to introduce the moderator for our next panel, Sherwin Tsai. Sherwin is a lead public policy manager at the Wikimedia Foundation, and Sherwin and our panelists are joining us today to discuss methods for observing and measuring trust and the impact those measurements could have on the interpretation and implementation of the law. Sherwin, I will now cede the floor to you.
Thanks very much. And thank you to everyone for being here and our panelists and our